All right, so here we are. So we're here to talk about this book called The Sovereign Individuals by two authors. By the way, do either of you know the authors off the top of your head? Any of you?
James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg.
Okay, yeah. If there's two authors, it's like I can't, that's too much work. I can't remember two authors, maybe one author, but.
Yeah, and published 1997. So
yeah.
25 years out, but still a fantastic book.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way that makes it, I think, even more impressive, which we can get into that because it's just so prescient.
Yeah. Your point some time ago we were talking is it is impressive in that some of the ideas expressed in there seem even more relevant now than they might have back then. I mean, this guy was really, really a prophetic, vision seer there.
Yeah.
Two guys, I should say. But.
Right. Yeah, and so me and Randy and Schalk have all read the book. I think Schalk's actually read it several times. And then Gordon has read it. Let's go ahead.
No, I've read it twice. Well, I've listened to it twice, and I want to listen to it a third time, but this time actually stopping and taking notes.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
And then Gordon, you read that pretty in-depth summary, or maybe it would be good just to start with you and hear your impression, because I suspect of the four of us, yours will maybe be most dissimilar. So I'm just curious. Maybe we can just start with you. And what do you think about it? What do you think about the thesis, the book, or the summary, I suppose?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say something about more just the dynamics of the conversation, but
please.
Okay. So I just wanted to say at the outset that what part of why I'm here most year is because I've had some great discussions recently with Logan and observed some other things, and part of it is, for me, it's not so much the interest in the book itself as the interest in connecting with people who are thinking deeply about topics of these broad trends in our culture altogether. And having a particular style of dialogue about it, which is sadly absent from a lot of my normal day-to-day life. And I'm finding a lot of it in this community that's based around rebel wisdom, but especially with what Logan is trying to do. So I'll just leave it at that. I think, I'm really interested in talking about this, not from the perspective of a deep knowledge of the book, but rather from the perspective of deeply engaging in interesting thoughts with interesting people who think about stuff. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
And my impression about the book is interesting. It's informed by a couple of things. Number one, by this review that I shared with you, Logan, and I'm glad to know that you felt like it was a comprehensive and relatively fair summary.
Yeah, and I'll put a link of that in the notes, the video notes for anyone watching this on YouTube.
Cool. And I also yesterday took some time in the afternoon to go read reviews on Goodreads. So got a little bit more perspective, and it was interesting to see some 5-star reviews and some 2-star reviews, and people's critiques of the book. And it gave me a different perspective on maybe the author's. What came up in the Goodread reviews was the author's strong libertarian philosophical stance, and people had good and bad things to say about it. That didn't come up in the first review that I read. So I'm curious we'll be curious to find out what you guys think from that, about that sort of fundamental perspective of individual versus society, as it seems to be embedded within the themes of the book, as well as, of course, the overall themes of how do societies evolve and how do they unfold, and how do we prepare ourselves for the future, given the situation that we find ourselves in. So, in sum, I think the fortune cookie slip that I got one time that said 10 people, 10 opinions, right? And none of us knows how the world really is in a certain sense, but everybody's got opinions, and we come together and make sense of things. And it sounds like these authors have some really interesting opinions and good thinking about it. So I'm really curious to engage in the conversation about the content. And I guess I see my role here as, not being deeply familiar with the content in the book. Hopefully my beginner's mind somewhat, or hopefully I can take that role at beginner's mind in this conversation and help to, to hopefully open up implications or avenues of discussion about the content that, that may unfold because of bringing the beginner's mind approach.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my thoughts.
Cool.
Well, I just had one little thing is that on the authors are actually both investment advisors working in U.S. Wall Street, that environment. So that money makes money environment of Wall Street. And so I just want to sort of put that out there that that's their, let's call it a worldview, and they're very successful in it. They're very well regarded in it, but that would sort of slant their view in some ways that some of us would know and recognize, and some of it we might not ever even see. But I mean, that's their Wall Street investment people, and that's their worldview. So we can go with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course the connection, just to make it explicit, is that worldview you could easily see that tying quite deeply into a libertarian, self-interested perspective that Gordon has noticed.
Self-interested and that key exactly. And I'm glad you said that, or someone else said that, because that was on my mind as well. And that they sort of, I had the same idea when I read the book 1984 by George Orwell. Of course, I read it when I was in college in 1984, just as kind of a cool thing to do. And it took me like 2/3 of the book to realize that I was not in this class of society that was going to come out on top. I was in the class of society that was going to be one of the losers, the dumb guy sitting on the couch watching football thinking he's got it made when the world really goes on around him and he is not anywhere near any of the levers that control anything. He is a pawn, a force of labor, blah, blah, blah. And so with this book, of course, I was reading happily along, kind of whistling my tunes, thinking that, yeah, I'll get my riches and I'll pull out and I'll go into the cyber world like all these people. But the reality of it is that most of us will not. We will be left behind. And so that's kind of a sobering realization when you're talking about the ideas in this book, is that, well, yeah, we the four of us, maybe one of us will make it out, and the other three will be probably left behind, So anyway.
Right.
If I can just...
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you what you think, Schalk.
Yeah, so on a couple of those things, I mean, just my broad impression, the first thing that I really liked about the book, and it's probably the fundamental thing that I like, because, I mean, we can get into everything they got wrong, and not only got slightly wrong, but like very wrong. And it's more than one thing that they got wrong. But what I really appreciated about it was it's almost as if, imagine we had a Rubik's Cube and we're trying to solve the Rubik's Cube by only looking at one edge. So there's a certain type of it's almost as if, and it's interesting for me because it seems to be an interesting parallel as to what's happening to society as well. There are, at least from my perspective, there's a regressive wokeness that's motivated by something. And part of it seems to be a fear to rotate the Rubik's Cube. They're really, really terrified of what they'll see if they look at the other side of the Rubik's Cube, or if they honestly comment on what's on the other side of the Rubik's Cube. So the result is basically this perpetual shuffling of only one side of the argument. And I think I see that a lot with, just with other communities and stuff I'm involved in as well. I definitely see the cryptocurrency guys doing a similar thing. It's almost like there's a wave, and it's always like, oh, we're on this one side of the Rubik's Cube now. Doing that. What I liked about this book was it's actually it really took it and rotated it in dimensions that I'd never considered before. And yeah, I really appreciated that part of it, and I appreciated their completely different take at the dynamics of what caused things. even though I think they are obviously more libertarian leaning, it is interesting for me that they probably made the most cohesive argument against full anarchy that I've come across. And that's just essentially that, listen here, you will not be able to defend, and you will not be able to defend a free enclave in the nation state era if you can't out-resource the massive thing next to you who wants to grab you and eat you. You know, you've got to be able to punch its lights out, otherwise you're not going to survive. So the tool that's now been introduced is stealth. And another thing that's also very interesting for me is, I mean, I've always held up Hong Kong as the model for how the world should work. After reading the book, like, one major thing that shifted in my mind is Hong Kong is a complete anomaly. It's a complete anomaly. The thing is, it was possible because the British Empire was protecting it and decided, okay, well, we'll subsidize its protection. It doesn't have to be in the dynamics that everyone else is in. If somebody tries to make nonsense with Hong Kong, we'll go defend it. And then that sort of de facto became the US's role. And for a long time, China didn't really want to mess with that. And now the dynamics have shifted such that where Hong Kong was initially something like 80% of China's GDP or some ludicrous number, I'll have to go look that up, don't quote me on that. Now it's only like 3%. So now for China, it's more risky to allow the Hong Kong people to break free. It's more risky to have them break free and have every other major city in China see that than it is to just suppress them and rather lose the 3% of GDP. So that kind of a dynamic wasn't really something I considered before. And what was interesting for me in the book was, even though they do have a libertarian slant on it, they were very honest about what would work and what wouldn't work, and why different things worked. And another thing is, I mean, the whole last chapter of the book is about morality, which I found very interesting. They specifically noted all the different things that will go wrong, most likely, with the sovereign individuals. And it's fascinating. I mean, Logan, especially between lots of conversations me and you have had, and I know some of the other communities you're involved in, that would also be a fascinating thing to chat about, is the blind spots of the winners in this, as this thing maybe progresses. But Logan, just for people listening, how about somebody gives a summary of the actual summary of what the book says?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot, because I actually just did this, I think earlier today. The idea is that we're shifting away from a societal configuration that's focused on nation states and politics, which you could say we've had roughly for 500 years, roughly since the Industrial Revolution. And there's also good reasons we had that, and it actually solved a lot of coordination problems. And so the authors are looking at that and making the claim that we're on the brink of a shift away from that. So a shift away from a 500-year-long structure, which is a pretty significant shift, into a world of sovereign individuals, where the individuals can play on a level playing field and maybe even outcompete nation states. And that has to do with what they call the returns to violence, which is a phrase I'm a little weirded out by. I think it should be returns of violence, but it's the idea that if you employ if you employ violence, how much can you profit from it? That determines all of the politics below it. And they're saying with the internet, that has shifted now, and you really can't get a lot done with violence, and therefore the nation states just won't be able to compete with the new type of, these sovereign individuals. And then just the only other thing I'd add to that is I keep saying he instead of they. It's rare to have a book written by two people, but they compare the shift that's happening now to the shift into the industrial era, or the shift away from feudalism,
agriculture.
Yeah. And they say, like, when the church controlled a lot of the narrative, but there was a lot of corruption in the church, you had I just love this comparison he makes. Everybody could not imagine that the church wouldn't be a central part of their life, and yet everybody commonly agreed that the church, the people that were running the church, were incredibly corrupt. So there was this like widespread disdain, which is extremely similar to the widespread disdain of politicians in politics today. Everybody's going like, it's almost, it's the least brave opinion you could have to say that politicians are scumbags. It's like, well, yeah, everybody, why even say that, rather make jokes about it, because we all know. And yet also everybody is hard pressed to imagine a world without politics. We can't really imagine it. And so, so he's really making the claim that very similar things are happening in both these shifts. And also that when that other shift was happening, people didn't know it. The people in the shift didn't know that that's what was happening. And so the fact that people may not feel like a shift is happening today really shouldn't be taken as any kind of evidence that it's not happening. So yeah, that's all the themes that I bring up when I bring up the book now to people.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I can add something to how I think the book predicts the future panning out. So the book predicts that due to certain things happening, which isn't necessarily all that clear the first time you read the book, but due to things like digital money, end-to-end encryption, privacy, and mobility, ultimately both intellectual mobility and physical, individual mobility. Now, what will happen is that what you can get from being violent. So the two factors on the returns to violence are basically, what does violence cost? In other words, how costly is it to go hurt someone? Right. And the second thing is, what can you get when you actually hurt them? Right. So recently we had a house robbery here, and we don't have a television. I don't have a PlayStation here. Literally, like we have wallets with no cash in them. We have cell phones that can only be sold for parts since they can't be unlocked, and we have laptops, right? So they took 2 cell phones and a laptop basically in our wallets, essentially. I haven't even replaced my wallet yet, right? They can't get to any of the money in my wallet. They can't get to, they can't access my phone without me, basically. So this was these guys were incredibly overwhelming force. They freaking came in here, they ripped off the security gate, they kicked in a door, they kicked in bedroom door, and then they had guns on them and stuff. And if the armed security or the police got here any earlier, then basically they would have really put their lives at risk to do this. And for what, really? Like, it's a couple of $100 worth of stuff, right?
So you're saying that is an example of the returns to violence already lowering in today's age?
Yeah. So it's very costly for them to do that. They have to associate with dangerous people. They have to put themselves in dangerous situations. And what can they get, really? Mm-hmm. They can't get my share of the companies that I've invested in, mm-hmm. Right? Maybe to a degree they could figure out that they could hurt me to get, crypto, but they can't even get all the crypto. Like, I can't even give it all to them, necessarily. Like, some of the technology that's in the pipeline will actually make even that step impossible. Like the Art Bank Vault will make that pretty much like a pointless exercise. Since other people will be able to see, hey, wait a minute, Schalk's in a bad situation and he's doing stuff with his money that's abnormal. So lots of that stuff, it just means that it costs a lot to be violent. You get very little from it. Now, if we take it from the state's perspective, they have a large infrastructure of surveillance and violence application that has slightly different returns, but it's becoming very similar for them. Because the thing now is basically that it costs a lot to maintain the system. They've got to justify the system by handing out free things, and everyone is becoming more and more demanding of free things. So the result is the people who produce something, South Africa is now, in my view, very near the point of collapse. You're a sane person in South Africa, leave naked with your life and your competence, right? That's kind of like, and really the trap is that other people here, and everyone's worried about how they're going to care for themselves, once they go over a border somewhere. But the result is that it's now a massively appealing proposition to leave. If you're going to get fleeced, leave. And the thing is, I think people don't really realize their options, but anybody who does any sort of information work now, thanks to COVID-19, it's now completely standard that people work from home. So there's the first major breakthrough, the one part that came out of the lockdown. But now what can happen is, if you have any sort of remotely applicable skill, if I can put it that way, fly somewhere else and go apply it from there. One of the great options is, me and Logan have been chatting about a lot of these options. One of the great ones, Georgia, you can go there as an expat if your income is
the country of Georgia, to be clear.
Oh yeah, sorry, correction. The country of Georgia, to be clear.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, and if you go there, basically you, as an expat, they treat you like a king. And you essentially, yeah, they've got a 20% income tax, but that income tax is not applicable to income that has its origin outside of Georgia. So there's a lot of reason to rather just move there. So now, from the nation state perspective, if you look at what the returns to violence are, they're now suddenly dropping quite considerably, right? Since,
and just to make that, if I could just make that explicit, because I think part of what you're saying is now the cost includes people will flee.
Yeah, well, yes. Now you've got to like keep people inside of your borders somehow. You've got to keep and you like the most productive people have the most means to flee from. Right. So in South Africa, if you flee, you pay a once-off exit tax. But I mean, given if you amortize that, yada yada yada, they actually go into cool examples in the book. It's totally worth it. Like the question they ask, and it's a brilliant question: is would you move to the Bahamas for $5 million? Right. I mean, it's a silly question if you just ask it like that. But if you look at the tax implications, that's kind of like what it boils down to. Move to the Bahamas, get $5 million for your trouble. That's kind of the implication. But what I just wanted to get to was the costs and the returns to violence for the nation state. Because the thing is, the nation state was very good at creating a scenario where you could build massively physically capital intensive things like factories and as a result cities. If you look at a city really works because if you have a lot of factories close to each other, then you can get a lot of spontaneous order out of that. And the bigger any city was and the more industrial activity it had, the better it did. Like that's sort of why Detroit was sort of the king of cities for a while, and now it's literally the zombie of cities. And Shenzhen after Detroit became sort of the absolute king of cities. Because the nation state was able to provide safety for these massively capital intensive things to actually bloom up and get created and so forth. And that's all they can really tax is the thing that's got to be slow and immobile, and then they can tax it.
They can tax factories, they can tax a law firm that has all their files in paper files, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of like what they can get away with taxing. But what they can't really tax is, if you think about it, if Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, right, lots of Facebook, the reason that they still get to tax Facebook to a large degree is because the payment networks are still highly regulated and still under regulatory capture for the time being. And I think as the other stuff we're doing with crypto really starts to, actually reach mainstream adoption, and it's insane to see that happen in real time, then at some point there will be a logical point for Mark Zuckerberg where he goes, the only reason that I tolerate the abuse of Congress. And I mean, really, if you've watched these interviews, I mean, you don't have to love Mark Zuckerberg to realize that yes, like United States Congress people are some of the most disrespectful people on the planet. I don't let the guy get a bloody word in edgewise. I mean, everything is an accusation. Everything is a freaking attack. It's really like literally, like there are some pretty bad characters in the world. I'm like, I'd have some sympathy for them if they were in front of Congress. In any event, but the thing is, at some point, you'll make the calculation that, wait a minute, I can move everything outside of the United States. I can distribute it. I can put it on Web3, and distributed web technology, and I can use crypto for the payment systems. And then I'm free. I'm free. All my investors are free. We're free. We can get the hell out of it. And we have the network effects to keep the thing that is Facebook going. And there wouldn't be a damn thing that Congress can do about it. And I think lots of why the world no longer makes sense to lots of people is because they had a model and they rent seeking and they want the model to continue. And now as the model starts to slip away, the impotence that that feels to me sometimes like the main impression I get from politicians, it's oftentimes like sort of an unconscious impotence. They're angry, they think they can still affect something, but they can't anymore. So now they have this weird, I don't know, whatever it is that's going on with Congress people in the US, that seems to me to be the sort of the motivation. But anyway, that's sort of the shift. That's the challenge for the nation state now is how do you keep Mark Zuckerberg around, because he can flee. How do you make him a deal that's worth his paying for it?
Yeah, and just to connect that, I see Gordon, you want to say something. I would just say Mark Zuckerberg is just the perfect candidate for the sovereign individual, just to make that explicit. So yeah, go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, I have a number of things I'd like to tie into this, but the fundamental question in my mind is, if we don't have so for the sovereign individual, they have derived their wealth from their interactions with society at large, right? The whole concept of wealth is largely a made up structure. It's largely a matter of human beings agreeing on what's valuable, and then finding a way to denominate value in a way that it can be concentrated. Right, so wealth is, there's only a certain amount of food you can eat. There's only a certain amount of pleasures you can enjoy, and ultimately, wealth is essentially a means of exercising control. Right, it's power. I think ultimately, value goes back to the power that an individual can exert over their environment. And the immediate sphere or the larger spheres of how broadly can they exert their control. I've been thinking about this for a while, and one way to make this clear is I've thought about how has the middle class existed throughout the 100,000 years of Homo sapiens on this planet. Has there been something that we would recognize as a middle class? And so my definition of middle class is that I, as an individual, I am middle class if I can more or less make my own decisions about how to spend my personal resources, my personal time and effort, right? I don't have somebody else telling me what to do, or forcing me to do something, and I don't have a significant amount of power to force other people to use their time and effort for my ends. I can pursue my own ends. I don't have to pursue somebody else's. I can't make other people pursue my ends. I don't have a whole lot to be able to do that with. And so if that's true, then I'm middle class. And you can see where the other ends of the spectrum go. So wealth, in our society today, wealth is ultimately an ability to marshal lots of resources to pursue your own ends, and to entice or ultimately compel people to pursue things. So the 1984 example that you brought up before, Randy, the folks sitting on the couch are arguably hypnotized or drugged or otherwise sort of compelled to not really pursue their own ends, and to be contributing factors in a society, but not to have a whole lot of agency. So now we're in a money economy, where money is primarily the means of effect and control. And what in the discussion so far, we've been talking about violence as being the means of effect and control as opposed to money. And in this discussion anyway, it seems that violence is the threat of physical force. So Schalk, you were talking about a couple people busting into your house with guns, but the violence scales in a lot of ways, and the authors are talking about having a culture that's with global internet, global connectivity, and an abstraction, making wealth a more the denomination of wealth becomes so abstract that it can't be physically controlled. But what if I can drop a bomb on every data center in North America? What if I have a drone that can drop a bomb on enough data centers and enough power generation or power transmission facilities to take out the internet in North America or in Europe or in China?
You could do damage, but you still couldn't actually confiscate the wealth. And I think that's an important point. So you could, because your return on that violence is still essentially zero.
And I just want to say something about the cost of doing that as well. And I think this is their point. I don't think the point is that it is outside of the realm of all physical possibility. But to give you an idea, there's in excess of 2 million data centers in the world, right? Data centers, I mean, the basis on which the internet is built, I mean, TCP/IP is so robust that back in the early 90s, when the US bombed Iraq, well, specifically in one bombing, they targeted the telephone exchanges. Within 20 minutes, all calls were connecting again, just purely because the off-the-shelf Cisco routers in the early 90s already had the capacity to route around all the damage. So the thing is, essentially, it would be such an incredible bombing exercise, right? Outside of the PR fallout of that, it would be incredibly expensive, and you wouldn't get much back for it, basically. And after you did it once, the response will be anti-fragile. Yeah. So the thing is, essentially, like, you do that once, the next time you will attempt to do it, all of these data centers will be underground. You know, they'll be highly protected. They'll actually, like, there won't be 2 million data centers. There'll be 20 million data centers. You know, and there will be completely different types of fallback mechanisms. So that's, yeah, that's kind of like how I see that going. And the other thing is, like, just to Logan's point, is what would be your motivation at that stage? Why would you do it if you're not going to win anything? You're only going to make enemies if you do try and bomb everyone.
Yeah. Good points. I definitely take your points, but you know, the anti-fragile nature of it, and I wasn't aware of the experiment in Iran.
Iraq.
That's you know, that's good experimental data. Still, my question, I think the fundamental basis of my question remains, which is, let me see how to phrase it. The real question is that for a massively wealthy person, still the wealth has to express itself as a matter of, you know, control over their own environment, you know, their ability to express their agency writ large, and that does depend in many ways on a stable society. I mean, at one level, wealth is really relative. Like, you know, another concept I would introduce here is the question of, you know, how at a certain point when you're, you know, amassing Bitcoin or even dollars in bank accounts, right? What is it that you're doing? Why do you want more? Right? Somebody asked John D. Rockefeller, you know, how much is enough? And his response was always just a little bit more. Right? Or another question, another response to, you know, how much is enough, is enough so that I can have better toys than my brother-in-law. Mm-hmm. Right? The wealth and power is always comparative it's always relative to, essentially, to your peer group.
Can I introduce? Okay, sorry. I don't know exactly what the format is, so I don't want to just interrupt you.
I just let me wrap this up and then back over to you. The question is, in a culture posited by these authors, what provides a stability of the culture that maintains a peer group and maintains context around that for them to be wealthy in? Without the nation state, what provides us, you know, without the church, people couldn't imagine what was a stabilizing factor, what's a glue for society. Without the nation state, you know, something will evolve, but what will it be?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the cool things I just want to say about the book is the book doesn't purport a philosophy, which is what I find interesting. It doesn't say, oh, this is how society should be. Mm-hmm. It basically takes the thing about this is how society is, and in fact, lots of the philosophies are only merely expressions of what could be. In other words, of what can be under those circumstances. Like communism and liberal democracy were things that could exist. I'd say there was the additional one of the minor kingdoms of Saudi Arabia and Switzerland. That's another discussion. Those are things that could exist under the current megapolitical structures.
And just to kind of, so megapolitical, just to point out the jargon there, the megapolitical is very tightly linked to the idea of returns to violence. So when the returns to violence changes, the megapolitical thing changes. So just back to you, Schalk. I just wanted to.
Yeah, so they're not saying that this is a good thing. This is in fact, large parts of the book doesn't say that it's a good thing. In fact, they're actually going into quite considerable detail about all the death and destruction that happened after every shift. And there's a real possibility that might happen, and it might happen in completely like irrational and insane ways. And I mean, if I look at what's happening in the US now, and the limited amount of reading that I've done on the Cultural Revolution in I believe it was the 60s in China, it's eerily similar. Like, it's really, really eerily similar. And people have these frustrations and they wish to vent them somehow, and they don't even know what the frustration is based in. So these things might really turn very violent, very ugly, and very, very bad. And I think people underestimate the non-linear nature of these things. People think that it's, we slowly over a 50-year period, Hitler became stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you look at how things happen, at every step people were like, no, it's going to get sorted out right now. No, it's not going to turn out that bad. Oh, no, it's going to somehow revert. And then just like that, basically, things got very real and very ugly. And that's before information technology was around to accelerate those processes. In terms of your definition of to exact control over the world and how much is enough, right? I want to interject a few things there. I do appreciate that you made the distinction between coercion and enticement. There's the first major difference that I'd like to point out is, I mean, people who are oftentimes upset about rich people are because I think they conflate the idea of being able to entice someone to do something with the idea of being able to coerce someone to do something. Now, the problem is that sometimes rich people do buy themselves laws, right? So lots of
guns,
Warren
for that
Buffett,
matter.
or guns, yeah. Well, they buy indirect guns, basically. They literally buy laws, which has an additional effect of making their victims guilty, which is, I'd say, far more insidious than just taking a gun to his head and taking his things. Because, I mean, one of the things, as far as I understand about Warren Buffett, is he's got all kinds of issues with estate taxes. But the problem is just he buys up these companies, after the estate tax essentially obliterates the control of the family over the entity. So that's kind of a negative control, negative way to use your wealth is to coerce people, right? But typically you do that by bribing the government. You either bribe the
nation
government
state,
or you bribe the nation state, basically, right? And how did there's a part in the book that I really like, and I thought when I heard it the first time, I was like, oh, he's talking about the U.S., where the guy was talking about Peru's Congress, where he said it was an advanced auction on laws. That's all the Congress had become, was just this auction house for laws. And it's incredible. There was a guy who in the US actually built like a company that would price laws for you. So that he'd actually go like, listen, this is how much, if you want this law written, this is how much it would cost. And they had like a whole model behind it that told them, listen, you need this guy elected, this kind of lobbying, and yada, 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 and you get your law passed. And he eventually went to jail for that. But the bottom line truth of the matter is that since voting is not anonymous in the US, in Congress and in the Senate, everybody thinks, oh, it's a good thing to see how our politicians vote. It's the worst possible thing you could do. The reason you vote privately is the same reason they should vote privately. Because if there was no way for them to prove to their backers that they voted the way that they wanted them to vote, if there was no feasible way to do that, the money would disappear out of politics since there's no receipt capability.
Yeah, so that they would essentially have the privacy to vote with their conscience even after taking a bribe to vote X or Y, right?
Exactly. And it would very quickly like deteriorate the returns to bribery.
Right.
But yeah, so on the thing of like people enticing people to do stuff, I have no problem with a guy being a quadrillionaire eventually, and I think we will see a quadrillionaire in our lifetimes probably. And him being able to literally like freaking buy the moon,
right.
and its inhabitants by that stage. I have no problem with that if he does it voluntarily. If he can entice those people with a good deal, then way to go, buddy. I'm all for that. It would be by definition win-win. I think one of the things that people miss about wealth, and I think it has to do with the West's divorce from real problems, Right. So really, like Europe and America, sometimes when I hear about the things that they, you know, their poverty and the things they worry about and stuff, I mean, it's laughable. It's really, some of it is laughable. We have a country next door called Mozambique. Mozambique, basically, it was a Portuguese colony for a long time, and then eventually, like, there was a civil war. They expelled all the Portuguese, and a communist government took over. And in the ensuing years, basically, they pretty much ate all the wildlife. And the worst thing about it was the infant mortality rate. Now, the last time I was there was 2005, and I'm not sure it's improved. It has definitely improved, but I'm not sure it's improved like absolutely astronomically. But half the children were not living until age 5. And my big thing, basically, as to why is freedom important and why is capital accumulation important, is basically, like, I don't care what you think about your, you know, the moral backing of your philosophy, or we could say that all things are relative, but the bottom line is basically, like, if children die, half of them die before age 5, there's probably something very, very wrong with the system. And the thing is, I think that if we can accumulate wealth and if we can control the physical world, and really, like, wealth, at least in a free market system, is a proxy for how much control we can exercise over the physical world. It's how much of our minds we could apply to solve other people's real world problems and actually get rewarded for that. How their problems first. That's kind of the real core of the thing. Yes, Gordon, I see you have a point there.
Yeah, I don't mean to disrupt the arc of your thought, but yeah, you know, a lot of what you're saying talks about the distinction between coercion versus enticement, and honestly, I like that distinction, but I see it as very much on a spectrum that gets very fuzzy, and enticement. In fact, enticement requires people to have a sense of lack, or a feeling of a sense of lack. And so my question around this has to do with, what do you know, let's look at labor arbitrage in the global markets right now, and you know, companies, the outsourcing phenomenon. So if we've got a free market where there's lots of very cheap labor, and we can maintain that sense of cheap labor by having huge populations that are living in circumstances of deprivation, then the line between enticement and coercion looks very, you know, starts to get very fuzzy. And, you know, bring this into your discussion, I think you're using this example of Mozambique to say, look, communism doesn't work, right? Centralized control doesn't work.
No, I'm pointing to why wealth is important. Wealth is an indicator of our control over the physical world. In a free market, that's the case anyway.
Mm-hmm. Is it, and do you conflate or distinguish human society, you know, and the collection of people as part of the physical world, part of the objective reality that wealthy people or a wealthy community has control over?
Okay, well, so I'm not 100% sure what your question is there, but so one thing where it would be relevant basically is if you have a society next to you that is starving and destitute, and you know, their children don't live to age 5, for instance, after their children don't make it to age 5, then if you are wealthy, you are definitely in a better position to help them than if you were also in that position. So that's on the positive case. On the negative case, basically, if you had a very aggressive communist government next to you who's constantly planning coups on your government, then keeping them out is another very necessary, you know, control over the real world. And I mean, it's going to get very physically real when there are armies crouching borders, you know. And in the other example, it's very physically real for those children who die.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to just maybe strengthen or fill in Gordon's argument in this back and forth, because I think the point Gordon is making that I appreciate is basically there's a third point that you could have added there, Schalk, which would be, if you have this destitute nation next to you and you're a wealthy individual, you can actually influence the people in that country to such a degree to a large degree. I think that's the first point to make, and you have a lot of control over the people. And I think that's what Gordon was sort of getting at when he said that the people are part of the physical reality that you can control. And I would also say that, I would say this, if you're an entity who at once, you have a lot of wealth, and so you're offering the wealth in one hand, but you're also continuing to oppress with the other hand, that, I guess, Gordon, I'm
violent.
Right. I'm curious, because when you talk about the sort of the spectrum between coercion and incentivizing, or what's the other word we're using? Not incentivizing. Enticing. For me, it comes down to if I as a person can simply stop coercing and instead, what was it again? Start enticing. For me, the contradiction or the tension seems to disappear in some sense. So if you have a neighboring country that's very poor, if you go and you offer deals to people with your vast wealth, I mean, it's still a shame that they're in a position where you have that control over them. That's still it's not a pleasant or positive thing. But if you are not contributing to the oppression or the degradation of their life, I guess my question to you, Gordon, is there still something about that makes you uncomfortable? Although Randy has something to say, I don't know which one of you wants to go.
Let me, if I can, let me jump in there and try to help out Gordon out where I think is some filling in the gaps. I think his point is that if you're a wealthy individual next to Mozambique and you're looking across the border, you're seeing, all this stuff that you think you can help or make money on, then you can exert your wealth across that border and into that other environment. And I think Gordon's point is that there's a fuzziness that starts to get really fuzzy between coercion and inducement. And my point is, I think Gordon's point is that if you can approach a person who is, starving, suffering from the weather and watching half their kids die and say, look, I'll give you $2 a day to sew these Nike tennis shoes up, then we can sort of call that an inducement. But really, it's in the situation that they are in, it's coercion. They can't escape this trap of, I've got to eat. I don't have any choice of selecting one inducement. I have to take this breather, and then I have that. I'm going to do enough. And so I think Gordon's point there, and I'm almost done, Gordon, you can jump in and correct if you want, but is that's where he sees the fuzzing of the line between inducement and coercion.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think have to explore this a little bit, but it's interesting. It's easy for a person with the wealth to feel good about themselves, to feel morally justified, to go in and offer jobs to people offer $2 for sewing Nike shoes, right, or whatever it is, to offer something to make their lives a little bit better. And it's an opportunity in that case for them to buy low and sell high, right, and consolidate their wealth to take some to add value themselves. And the natural impulse is to try and keep their costs down and their profits up. And of course, everybody will is motivated to do that, and it's not a bad thing. But in a situation where there's the world's the individual who's doing this did not create the circumstance. They're part of a system that created the circumstance. Maybe not intentionally created it, but somehow this is the world they find themselves in, and this is a world that many major multinational corporations find themselves in, where it's really easy to get your accounting done in India or the Philippines. Not really easy, but but you can do it for pennies on the dollar relative to getting your accounting done in North America or in Europe. And so that leads to a bunch of disgruntled people in North America. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not going to comment on it at this point. But I will say, I guess my my puzzle within this conversation and my view of looking at the Rubik's Cube, so the angle that I'm looking at it from is that I basically consider all of this on the spectrum of violence, right? The fact that children are being born in Mozambique, they're suffering violence that is not the same sort of thing as somebody, it's not as intentional and personalized as somebody beating in their door, or hauling them away in chains, but there's violence that is happening here.
And can I just ask you why you use the word violence specifically?
Because it's a word that we've been using already, and it's because I want to. Because I'm reflecting on it from the perspective of the individual. I'm kind of in some ways thinking back to what Randy was talking about at the beginning, the recognition that this trend towards sovereign individuals, or and I can see lots of other ways to put it into words, but it leaves a lot of people behind. This is what Jamie Wheel talks about if you follow his stuff, essentially looking for the rapture. And there's millions of, thousands anyway, of examples of groups that are looking at these trends in our culture and saying, you know what, there's a keyhole event coming up, and I'm going to be in the group that makes it through the keyhole.
Okay. I like that. I like that metaphor.
So that may be true, and at the same time, I'm sitting here looking at the circumstances and saying, the keyhole that is likely to come is likely to be not just for the human genome, the Homo sapiens genome, but in fact most of the DNA in the biosphere. And so I'd actually rather avoid that keyhole event. For humanity's sake, for my own personal DNA's sake, and for the sake of the biosphere as a whole, for the sake of the complexity. So, Logan, I see your hand up, and I realize I'm getting possibly far afield from this, but and the question is, why do I refer to this as violence? Because again, I think from the perspective of the individual organism, the fact that damage is being done to my interests, constraints are being put on my agency, whether it's suddenly introduced by the police battering my door, or by robbers battering my door, or whether it's systemically present because I have no opportunities in the slum that I live in. Or I have no opportunities in the information culture that I live in, and the access to the information that I might have because I live in China, or because I'm tuned into the mainstream media, or whatever it is. I see all of those as assaults on individual agency, and so I'm characterizing them all as violence. It may not be the right word. I'm open to others, but that's where I'm at in this conversation right now.
Yeah, let me just jump in real quick, and then Logan, you can go. Is that I want to support the use of the word violence, because the whole book, Sovereign Individual, used that term to refer to all sorts of nation-state violence, including economic constraints, trade embargo stuff, anything that could be pretty far away from a gun or actually harming someone physically. And they bundle that all under the term violence. I'm fine with that.
Okay, well, so I'm actually want to push back against it quite a bit. And and I suspect Schalk, well, I saw him nod, which is not surprising. I'll just say that it's not surprising to see him nod when I begin speaking. I think violence needs a perpetrator, or at least a system that is perpetrating, but it does need some intentional perpetration for it to be violence. And that's what I see missing in the expanded definition that we're sort of proposing here. The children in Mozambique that are dying, are they suffering violence? I'm just trying to think aloud here. I mean, they're certainly suffering tragedy, but I don't think we can really call it violence until someone is, or some group of people, or some organization, some entity or agent is actually doing something to them. Now, the things that led to their situation, I think there's a lot of that we could call violence and coercion. But I don't think we can really say that they're facing violence today without also saying, without sort of assuming that there's like still some coercion going on. Maybe there is, but the state of affairs where children are being born into destitution, and there's like, let's just say there's not any food and people are starving. I don't think we can really call that violence. I think, well, I would certainly rather reserve that word for when there's an agent perpetrating violence or threats of violence, rather than a very tragic situation. And again, to be clear, I think violence did lead to it and coercion did lead to it. So that's, yeah. That's what I got.
Okay, so just on my part of the pushback on so my favorite, I've got a lot of like very favorite quotes from V for Vendetta, but I think my favorite one is, while the truncheon may be used in lieu of conversation, words will always retain their power, because words contain the means to meaning, and to those who would listen, the enunciation of truth. And the fact of the matter is that words have actual content, right? And if we can do a few things to words to make the content go away, right? And in many of the communities I've been involved in, I've seen the practice of making the meaning of words sort of go away, so that the bad implications of what we're really doing, fade into the background. And one of the things basically is that I think violence, for me to say, Logan, you're a poo-poo head, is an insult. It's not violence. It might not be a good thing to say. It might be hurtful, but it's definitely not violence, right? For me to take a gun to Logan's head and tell him, give me your stuff, I've applied violence to him. Basically, I've coerced him, which is where his free will has to choose between his physical well-being, and his property. That's coercion. The moment you make somebody make that choice, that's coercion. And the thing is, language is definitely expressive enough for us to give the correct meaning to these things, right? And what we do with violence, though, that I find disturbing in lots of the conversations that I see happening, is on the one hand, we conflate violence with stuff. So in other words, we say that, the fact that people are poor in India is violence. I disagree with that, right? So violence it's a word that has a meaning. I mean, we can try and restate that meaning, but then there would still be concepts that could have other words and new words assigned to them that are discrete concepts. The other thing we do is we obfuscate some things, right? So for instance, when someone is taxed 10% of their income arbitrarily, right? People might say, yeah, but that's not violence, because nobody hurt the guy. The fact of the matter is that it's definitely coercion from violence, in the sense that the guy has to choose between his physical well-being, being able to walk around freely, or his property, right? So now we've obfuscated it. So we can do two things. We can conflate and we can obfuscate, the meaning of words. And I think if we keep the meanings clear, then things actually make more sense to us, and we can actually sort of like move forward with the world, essentially. And we can sort of, I think it's also very freeing, because we can stop feeling guilty about certain things, because I think lots of things are conflated for us and we feel somehow guilty. I see this a lot with like, we have Airbnb guests in this house I'm in frequently, when they're allowed to travel. Lots of them are from Germany, and I always find it very fascinating. I have this conversation with them the whole time, where I tell them, because lots of them feel intensely guilty about being German. Like, you can't believe it. It is truly strange for me to, then I have this conversation with them, and partly because I like seeing the reaction, to be honest, but partly also because I don't want to see people suffer from a strange guilt that they have no personal part in. I tell them, listen, Germany has done, like, the German people have been a net boon to the world, and like, honestly, we would all be poorer and worse off if it wasn't for them. And then, I mean, I've gotten aggressive responses to this from German people who are like angry at the fact that I would suggest such a heretical statement, that I would want to release the guy from his guilt is just, oh. So anyway, so the first thing is, it's like, they typically think in terms of one specific part in history, which obviously the Second World War and the part leading up to that. Basically, they think of the genocide of the Jews, which is all very, very horrible and tragic things which should never be justified. But that's all people think about. They don't think about that society's benefit to the rest of the world. They don't think about how productive a society it is. I mean, China only overtook Germany in 2009 as the world's #1 leading export economy. Now, there's only 80 million, at that stage, there were only 80 million Germans, and there were 1.2 billion Chinese. So that just goes to show you how much more productive free people are than slaves. Like orders and orders and orders more productive.
That's a snapshot, and where China was coming from versus where Germany was coming from with our industrial base. So interesting point, but I don't follow you on the leap to that conclusion.
Okay, but let me so let me just basically get to the thing. The major problem is just that those individuals, and this is really the major problem, those individuals feel individually guilty. Right? They think things, and I've had conversations with them where they think things like, and I'll talk to them and I'm like, well, listen, why do you feel bad about being German? And then this woman would, and it's weird, like these people get flustered, they get upset, and I'm not being attacking, I'm literally like, why do you feel bad about being German? And the one conversation I had was about tomatoes, right? So there are migrant workers in Italy, right? So first of all, she's never met these workers, right? They're in Italy. Secondly, I can guarantee you, Italy's laws on labor are considerably like, anyone doing manual labor in Italy is in a considerably better position than anybody doing manual labor in most of Africa, right? So there are migrant workers in Italy, right? So people who didn't have other opportunities are now basically working in tomato farms, which she say these people are being oppressed. And I asked for details. Okay, but how are they oppressed, right? What were their other options, right? So in other words, they were born into the world, same as me and you. They had certain cards dealt to them, and now they're playing these cards. Your assumption is that if you remove tomato farming in Italy from them, that they're better off. And not only is that your assumption, but it's very light on the details. It's very, very light on the details from why are you guilty because you're German and eating tomatoes. That's how far the leap goes. And I just want to link it back into that whole thing about poor societies who do all the labor. I think the big thing is that what America doesn't realize, or at least what individual Americans don't realize, is how incredibly wealthy specifically India and China have gotten because of the outsourcing of jobs to those places. Both of those places and their governments now have both of those places are a lot richer. Often their governments have a very big problem because they now have far wealthier and far better educated populaces, which are classically far harder to control, right? So both those societies are far, far better off because of something that the Americans view as somehow having outsourced the oppression and the climate change and the list goes on and on as to why people should feel guilty for living in a good society.
So I love your incentive to pop people's guilt about the circumstance, and I think there's a whole nother that's probably a whole nother conversation. And the question, so Logan, you were bringing up the point about we shouldn't call it violence. Let's basically defining where violence is and what's just tragedy. So I think the line is fuzzy, right? But it probably merits us putting some attention there and seeing what we can do. I haven't actually looked at it that closely myself, and maybe we can, out of this conversation, we can come up with some new insight. On one end of the spectrum, I can see that a tropical storm hitting, typhoon hitting India some weeks back, or tropical storm Faye just was in the headlines here in the Northeast. That's a tragedy, or the impact of that is a tragedy. An individual going into a circumstance where people have suffered a tragedy or suffered tragedy on tragedy on tragedy, and say using their circumstances to using their depleted circumstances to give them lesser enticements to do something. That's probably a good thing for those people. And I would say that the violence in that circumstance has to do with the fact that you can now use those people as a threat to people in other circumstances. To look, if you don't accept a lower wage, then I'm going to take this job elsewhere, and you know, and you're SOL. And in fact, you know, I'm going to be using my position and my power to kind of bring these people up a little bit as a, and it's a threat to other communities. So the fact of having these great imbalances in the world enables the exercise of power, enables the exercise of violence. And so therefore, if you happen to be in a position where you have enough resources to influence the physical world enough to choose whether or not to maintain these imbalances or to equalize them out, then certainly you're incentivized to maintain them, at least from a sheer financial and power perspective. So therein, I do find violence. It's not directly violence to individuals necessarily, but that's a place that's the part that my intuition is really uncomfortable with in this place, and I'm interested to know what you guys think.
Yeah, if I can go there, I sort of want to push against Schalk a little bit here and go with Jordan for the discussion, in as polite a way as we, that this is good conversation, genuine good conversation, listening and all that. So I don't want to bully anybody, but and to a nod to Schalk, I want to say that here in the U.S. we have a new slogan to chant has kind of come on the scene, and that is silence is violence. In other words, remaining quiet about oppression and racism is actually contributing to the violence of that. And so I think that's a good example of really skewing the meaning of words to sort of say, just being silent is now, what are we going to call that, a microaggression? I mean, where does this insanity end? I mean, we're way off the rail of English. And as a writer, I mean, Mr. Wordsmith, and I love writing and poetry, and I love twisting the meaning of words, especially in poetry, to get rhyme and rhythm and also a good twist on meaning in my poems. Oh, I'm all over that. But to say silence is equal to violence, well, now I'm not even sure I can get even that into even my poetry. That's pretty far off the rails. So I do want to give a nod to Schalk on that. And then, but another little slogan has popped up in the U.S., and that is on the topic of, let's say, Walmart is probably the poster child for this, is to say that Walmart on the very bottom, and McDonald's is, McJob and all that, to offer a job at the very bottom rung of their organization is oftentimes below what we're pushing for, a $15 U.S. minimum wage thing, $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour and there. And so the phrase that has come up in light of this is, you're not a job creator, you're a poverty exploiter. And that, I think, is key on, and we're bending some words here again, but that's key on to the sort of predicament that people that are stuck in poverty here in the U.S. or Mozambique, they got, like Schalk said, they got handed a hand of cards. And some of them are at the very bottom end of the goddamn deck. I mean, they're not even cards, they're little clablets of dirt and dung and whatever. So, but people stuck in there, when they're offered a job, boy, they don't have many options. And so is that enticement, or is that coercion of their, because of their circumstances? So I'll shut up at that point.
Okay. Sorry, Logan. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, well, I think the last thing you said there stuck out to me, because you said they have virtually no options. And I think you and I, Dad, have actually had this conversation before, so you'll recognize this point. but to come to the guy in Mozambique and say, I'll give you $2, a day to make my shoes, you're really doing nothing more than giving them one more option. And if they take that option, that probably indicates that it is the best option that they have. So, well, that's all I want to.
Okay.
I'll also just say real quick, sorry, just that exploitation is a word that makes me uncomfortable. It feels to me like a dirty word that maybe covers up subtlety that could be explored if it wasn't for the fact that it was a dirty word that kind of can trigger people. So, yeah.
Okay, so I want to say a few things, right? So as a South African, basically, first of all, I think that in the West and in the US, right, if you compare your poorest people, right, to our middle class, really, your poorest people are better off in many cases. They're actually like considerably better off. I can't remember the exact quote now, but I think it's from Thomas Sowell, who spoke about slavery, where he was like, listen, if the victims of slavery were alive today and the perpetrators of slavery were alive today, then there would not be enough money to recompense the victims, and there would not be punishments cruel enough to inflict on the perpetrators, but the gravest placed them both outside of our control. However, today, if you go look at today, African Americans today in the United States are far, far better off than they would have been in Africa. Right, that's probably going to get me banned from all kinds of platforms, but that's why we build our own platforms. Comparatively speaking, there's no argument to be made. Comparatively speaking, right? So the problem is basically that you guys now have a large swaths of your communities, and your assumption is, and this is a dangerous assumption. Come look at South Africa, you'll see where it ends up. Your assumption is that because someone is loud, violent, and entitled, that, oh, wait a minute, he's got real pain and I should listen to it. My argument is that in the vast majority of those cases, that is completely false. That's not what's happening at all. That is a strategy, and it comes from a very dark place. That strategy is meant to make people feel guilty, to get them to shut up and not be challenged so that they can do whatever they like, right? And if you look at society, the single biggest indicator of whether or not you will get airtime is your willingness to become violent. You will get no airtime if you have no willingness to become violent, basically. I would say that lots of these movements in the US, I just quickly calculated, by the way, Logan is he's earning considerably less than $15 an hour. Right. I mean, he gets to build his own business, work on his stuff, and I mean, he's the majority shareholder in what he gets to build for himself. But that is considerably lower than what these people who want to flip burgers are insisting is a minimum livable wage in the US, right? It is, I mean, in a global context, it's unthinkable. It's just freaking unthinkable to me that that's the case. I want to say one more thing, Gordon, and then we go over to you, and I'll yield to you again. You said a thing earlier about exploiting the poverty. Now, the thing is effectively that you would be exploiting the poverty if it wasn't a dynamic system. So in other words, the guy's poor and that's a permanent state for him. He can never get out of poverty. The thing is just you're competing as an entrepreneur, not only for clients, you're also competing for resources and labor. And the thing is, as someone who's employed people, if you let good people go, it's hard to get them back, right? You lose people. You've got to actually constantly adjust what you offer labor to actually maintain the labor so that your organization can move forward. And the thing is, essentially, if you're sort of like bargain bin shopping here, first of all, as somebody who runs a business, that's the last thing you want to be doing. Really, any sane entrepreneur will tell you, listen, you actually try to buy from the top, not from the bottom of the labor market. You've got to give people the best possible options so that they stay with you, the expertise of your organization can grow and you can move forward. If you're sitting with people who are so entitled that they're at the bottom of the bucket now, basically, and you tell them, listen, guys, either you shape up or I'm going to ship this thing to India where the guy actually gives me a good attitude, and actual output, then it's no longer, it's an entirely different situation, right? And not only that, but even if that was the case, even if it was the case that, listen here, you've got to go and tell the guy, listen, I can get this done cheaper elsewhere. You've got to keep in mind that there are other entrepreneurs who also shop from the labor market. And if nobody wants to buy this guy, sometimes we have to ask the question, why? Why don't they want to pay this guy what he thinks he's worth? And I'm going to go with the dirt simple, at least this seems true for me for North America. The reason that happens is because the guy doesn't deserve it. He can't produce more than he's insisting on getting.
Okay.
Gordon, over to you.
Schalk, there are a whole lot of pieces in there, and I'm gonna which ones to start with? Number one, I think I love this because I think we're getting at some of the real root elements and attitudes that I see expressed in the culture war as we're experiencing it here. And at some level, I have a certain amount of concern that I don't want to engage in warfare, so to speak.
Okay.
I definitely want to try and get at these ideas without disagreement. And I'm noticing some places where I'm getting a little bit triggered myself. So, okay. Potentially dangerous territory. So let me see which pieces to pick up. Talking about the living wage. Okay, so actually the thing that I really want to dive in on is what I'm hearing implicit in what you're saying is one of the fundamental assumptions of a market economy is perfect information, perfect information sharing, that all participants in a deal have full information and essentially are engaging in the transaction as individuals with free will and with perfect information. We all know that is not true, that what enables us to buy low, sell high is differences is multiple differences, but knowing something that nobody else knows is one of the best ways to do that, right? Is how you can have a sustainable competitive advantage. You have, if you don't have a patent, you have trade secrets, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that perfect information, perfect understanding of the world, shared understanding of the world assumption gets built into a lot of the notions of transaction in a market economy. And especially the transactions around, people making choices about their future and about whether taking that $2 a day job is a good idea. It really is, Logan, what you said about a person, that it may be the best option for a person. And I would submit that it may be the best option in the moment, but not really the best option long term. As Schalk was pointing out, you could probably make much more dollars per hour by existing in a different, taking yourself to a different location. But you're actually getting more value by doing something where you're not making as much money in the short term. And you have the information and the understanding, the perspective on the world to be able to see that and make that choice. So I don't have to call it violence to say that other people don't necessarily have that same perspective, but it doesn't make the system right that we're able to take advantage of people who don't have that same perspective. I'm not sure how to solve it or how to address it, but it's a place that troubles me, and it troubles me from the perspective of from multiple perspectives. But I do think that it makes the system itself more dynamic and less sustainable, and helps propel us towards that keyhole event. So that's one of, I can put that out there as a reason why it troubles me. So let's see what else.
Can I respond to?
Let's do that. Let's stay, because like I said, there were many things embedded in what Schalk said and things I wanted to respond to, but let's keep it more narrowly focused.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm open to how the conversation goes. It's been going well so far. It's interesting, just on that, I suppose, the clear implied division lines. I think Schalk and I are on, let's say, one side. I'm even nervous to even use these terms because as you said, Gordon, I don't want, I want to stay as far away from like a warfare sort of debate frame. And that gets back to the community that you and I are both a part of, and go a different route. But it also is clear that there's like there's like I don't want to say a division, but a distinction, a useful distinction in the topology of this conversation, where Schalk and I are on one side, and then Randy and Gordon are on the other.
Yep.
I've actually forgotten my original point. I raised my hand, so I'll just leave it. I'll leave it at that. But
can I ask one thing though, because I do think we're drifting quite far away from the sovereign individual thing, right?
True.
And I think what I'd really like, actually, because I could see Gordon got the most upset with my statement about African Americans in Africa versus America, and I think that might actually be a very good separate conversation to maybe have, right? And I think it would maybe even be far more productive than people really realize. Okay, but I think maybe I'm more than willing to have a conversation with that, and we can pull in a whole bunch of people. I can pull in like local Africans, and then you guys can pull in some African Americans, and we can see how that conversation basically evolves. But just to pull it back to the sovereign individual, I think one of the things that I like about the sovereign individual that makes it less warfare and more just basically you've got to navigate the circumstances that you're in. Is the book really had a massive slant of, listen, it's going to shift. People are going to be massively unhappy. Some people are going to lose and some people are going to win from the argument, basically. But the bottom line is neither the winners nor the losers really control where the tide is turning. The tide is turning, right? And it's a question of how do you as an individual navigate yourself in this tide, basically, and then how do you branch out from there, your friends, your family, and the greater society, and how do we actually survive that shift? If there is something to survive and it's not a massive boom. Yes, Logan.
Yeah, this is actually something's coming to mind that was coming to mind earlier that I wanted to speak to. So we keep mentioning this keyhole event. And I think in some previous conversations, I think, Gordon, you were part of this, one of them anyway. There's this idea of, there's like, okay, first of all, there's like extinction level events humanity has to worry about. Let's not build an AI that turns us all into paper clips. There's also, but then there's not extinction level events, but there's another term, but we're using the term keyhole events where, okay, only some of us will survive. So let's get on the ark. That's another term that came up recently. We're building the ark. And I would like to bring in something else that comes up in these other conversations, which I think is really helpful. And also applies to the sovereign individual. What we can do, and what I find myself focusing on, is how do I navigate these stormy seas? Because I am a perspectival being, and that's where I am. So what do? Obviously, that's a pretty immediate question. But then also, as you put that together, you can start to think about, how do we make this keyhole event more of a shift, that like, how do we widen the keyhole, or how do we all turn into the thing that can go through the keyhole? And especially what we're doing with these conversations, this conversation, and then and I'm having a lot of these conversations, not just in our community, Gordon, but also just these things are happening more and more. And I don't think it's just because I'm trying to do it in the channel. I think people are finding the key somehow is in these types. First of all, the key is in conversation, and I think some people are realizing a particular kind of conversation. But the point I want to get to is the idea that also is added in is the idea of let's figure out how to survive ourselves as a unit, and then that can serve as a crystallization point, or no, what's the term? The crystallization site or something, where we do this, and then we learn how we did it. How we coordinated to survive the stormy seas, and others around us can start learning from us. And that could be because we're deliberately teaching, or it could be because people are watching this YouTube video and they think, oh, I'd like to have a conversation like that. And that, I think, it seems like it's the only viable strategy, the only reasonable strategy. Look around at your immediate environment, build your raft, and then as you do that, open source it and share it with as many people as you can, and learn from everybody else too. And I think, and maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but I also feel like we all have no choice but to operate from within our networks. We're all going to be embedded in networks. We can't go to the top and tell everyone else how to do it. We can't command the solution down from high. We can't go save the world like I'm going to save the world. The world is saved by me. That's becoming less and less feasible, as even the people in power are realizing, which gets back to, I think either Schalk or Randy was saying, the politicians, they're trying to exert control and they don't feel like they have it anymore. And so within this network, you know, we don't have to solve the whole problem, but if we can think through it in this exploratory way, and then we can open source and share that information, then everybody will find a way through the keyhole. That seems to me to be the best way to think about it, the best way to frame the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Did we lose Schalk on the video part? His picture just disappeared from the top on my screen.
I'm still here. Somebody's going to come install burglar bars in my home at the moment. So yeah. So the moment you guys still hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
He
has to hide all the dead bodies, so he has to turn off his video. So.
Right.
Well, yeah. So if I can jump in and just continue the sort of the back to the sovereign individual. One of the things is that I believe that we are absolutely on the threshold of a major societal shift. And so going back in the book theme, you know, the shift from a hunter-gatherer to
agriculture probably
was 5,000 years. And then from agricultural to industrial was 500 years. And now I think the shift that of course, the industrial, let's kind of say, is right now just closing out. And something else is just now starting up. So how long is that interval going to be? The transitional time? We're talking 25 to 50 years at the outside.
That's what I think
generation
too.
Or two.
Yeah.
So because of that, the rapidity of this shift is just going to, nobody's going to be able to say, oh, I've seen this coming from a long time out. I know the route through here. I'm going to skate through on one wheel up and rollerblade away, no problem at all. No, we are all going to be scrapping and screaming and run around like headless chickens just because of how absolutely fast this transition will sweep the rug out from under all of us.
Yeah.
I don't care how well you're positioned. Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, they will all suffer huge transformations in their lives that no one could have fucking seen coming.
Exactly.
And yeah, their huge wealth will soften the landing, but they're going to be spending money in ways that they had no fucking idea at all coming up. So yeah, they'll handle it better than some, but holy shit, even those guys up in that stratosphere, probably not all of them will land successfully. Their wealth lost because they didn't move it to crypto soon enough, or unknown things are going to be happening here in the next 25 years or 25 minutes if some bomb goes off. And when I say bomb, I mean something like the COVID-19 all of a sudden mutates and goes from 10% infection mortality to 95% transmission and mortality. That could happen. Okay, gentlemen, I want to say we ain't seen the end of COVID-19, and we ain't seen the not even half of this transitional phase from industrial to informational. And part of that, going back to kind of the violence thing, and I don't want to beat that too much, but even the use of information is now like ammunition. Okay, so
yes.
We can use
it can be employed for warfare.
We can use information in the info warfare, and we can do severe damage from my little keyboard here. I don't have to spend very much resources at all to send out a little information bomb that shifts society, a little tweet, a little Facebook thing, a little this, that, and the other, little fake video that goes viral. All of a sudden I've shifted the whole conversation a degree or two, and I didn't spend much money other than electricity and hardware. So
yeah, I love it.
See what else. Schalk, your congressional bubble, I want to expand on that just a hair. I agree that these people still think that they have their hands on the levers of control. I think at the same time, they're starting to get a little bit nervous and look around like, hey, why aren't the levers of control producing the same results they always did. I still have them. They're still here. I'm still a paid congressional member. Why are my efforts not quite bringing the return that they used to? And why is my lobbying money maybe starting to get a little bit soft here or there? I thought I could count on that guy to fund my campaign. Where'd he go? Oh, he bailed to the cyber. You know, he's a sovereign individual up here somewhere. He's no longer going to be lobbying you because he don't need you. Okay, so and the auction for laws. I love that analogy, the auction of laws. And so when we talk about some congressman being lobbied heavily for some agricultural support, farmer subsidy kind of something, and he's really going at that hard, and then all of a sudden COVID-19 stomps that into smithereens, and now all of a sudden the more heavily funded laws are not talking about agricultural subsidies anymore, they're talking about something else. And so the auction of laws, I think that's a very much a market-driven reality. I love that analogy. A different conversation, but I just want to point it out, I'm on the opposite side of the secrecy of the vote. I want more transparency in all votes. And that's just an interesting observation. And then the middle class.
Before listing off points, I really like to try to maintain the conversational flow.
Oh,
so
one at a time. I forgot about that. Yeah. So yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
No, no worries. I'll just say really quickly, I really like and maybe this is why I stepped in just now, I really like the conversation really seemed to pick up and start spiraling up in a really interesting way. And so I maybe want to just back up a little bit and try to recapture that.
Yeah.
And I think it's...
I have a question that I think might actually just facilitate that a little bit, right? So it sounds to me like, you know, there are, personally, I'm very excited about a world in which I can move jurisdictions, right? So I am in a late stage jurisdiction, right? So my jurisdiction has turned very, very negative, right? And it's crazy to see the disconnect, right? It's crazy to see how badly we've been spending our money. It's crazy to see the absolutely like genocidally racist nonsense our politicians can say publicly with no kickback. And it is insane for me to basically see the normal person on the streets disconnect as to what's happening and what he can do about it, right? So for me personally, like the idea of it being very cheap, it's in fact cheaper for me. There are certain other jurisdictions, Vietnam and Georgia being the two top ones at my list at the moment, that are cheaper for me to move to, that are ultra safe, and that I have less tax liability, right? So for me, it's an incredibly attractive proposition to think, holy Moses, you know, like I'm in this house that's on fire with people who still, you know, want to take showers and baths and sit and watch TV shows and stuff like that, you know. And it's fascinating to me that, okay, well, at least I know where the exit is. I know where I can go. I know that place isn't a fire hazard. So I'm super excited about the transition just from a survival perspective. And I can understand why, like, certain other people would be very worried about this, right? So people who maybe are, you know, on some form of welfare. You know, I know some countries have multiple generations of people on welfare. I can understand how if you were one of these people and you saw, but wait a minute, it's actually the same trend that I'm excited about. You know, the implication is basically that this trend will burn my house down. You know, it will mean that all of these people that I've come to rely on, even though I've never really said that, are going to be able to escape the system. You know, and then the incomes that come to me are basically going to go away. So maybe let's talk about that. Let's talk about the positives, I think, to a degree. Let's talk about the positives to everyone, including even the guy in the second example that I now said, basically. What are the positives of the shift for those people?
I would say, just like a meta note, I felt excited about the chaos. So I don't want to lose the idea of the chaos. Just in this conversation, when it was spiraling up and we were getting more energized, there was something about the chaos. So if I can maybe add that to what Schalk is saying, I mean, that sounds pretty cool to talk about the positives and the chaos that we see. And to me, just to maybe echo some of what Schalk was saying, that's the two biggest things. When I think about the future, I'm really excited and I'm really not exactly scared, but very nervous and intimidated, because I know that, as you were saying, Dad, like, and I can feel it happening now. The chaos is mounting. I used to plan for a year in the way that I now plan for a month, and I think that's going to keep foreshortening, right? And that is, I don't know if it's exactly scary for me at this point, but I'm pretty nervous. I'm pretty intimidated. But I think also maybe part of what Schalk was saying is, now that, and Schalk and I have been talking a lot about this, we're both in South Africa and both looking to leave.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Logan. The people have just come for the burglar bar thing.
Okay.
So I might be in and out for a minute or two just to get everything here started, so long. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, so just the positive side is I'm looking for the exits. I know where the exits are, and there's something exciting about that. You know, if stuff is burning down, I guess part of why I'm excited is because I've been thinking about this kind of transition for a long time, or something very similar, which probably has roots in my cryptocurrency involvement, because the cryptocurrency thing is very much building a new system because the old one should or will fail. But at this point, and especially, I think in the coming months, it will be, I won't even have the luxury of being excited or scared. I'll just have to be reacting and moving and going, oh, I'm going to move over there. Oh, I'm going to, the roof will fall down, and oh, I got to catch that roof and move to a different house, Yeah, I don't really have a point there, but that's how it's manifesting for me.
It's really interesting to hear you bring these things up. One of the things I pick up in this is, number one, the chaos brings us into the present moment. And being alive and energized in the present moment is one of the best feelings for a human being. I would posit for a sentient being, period. Sort of just that sheer presence. It's a critical element of flow state. If you look at there's lots of research and discussion around it. So a highly chaotic environment is awesome for that for getting into flow, and flow just automatically feels good. So that at least resonates for me in what you're talking about, and sort of the excitement of looking ahead at the chaos. The other thing, though, is that what Kotler and Wheel have talked about around flow, and the rise of Superman, looking at extreme sports athletes and Navy SEALs and other people in doing their research studying flow. The optimal thing for flow is that the challenge rating runs about 104% of your capacity. So you're just slightly, you're at your growing edge of capability. You're reaching just a little bit beyond what's possible for yourself. So, Logan, as I look at you, I don't know how old you are, but I think I'm probably closer to your dad's, to Randy's age than to yours. And I think I put myself in your shoes as a free agent, so to speak, but not as deeply rooted in any one community, or Schalk, with the ability to move to Vietnam or Georgia, as a couple of options. I mean, halfway around the globe, moving, 3 different continents as options for him. Yeah, in those circumstances, the upcoming chaos certainly can look exciting. It might be 104%, it might be 120, it might be 500% of what your capabilities are. But it's like gearing up for a sports competition, getting ready for going in for an MMA fight or something.
Yeah.
So I definitely resonate. I can really climb on board in your excitement there, but I can't fully climb on board because I have a kid.
Yep.
Right. And I look at the span of humanity, and I'm at an age where I feel my own capabilities. Where I might need to go get a new prescription on my glasses, because my eyesight is, which was phenomenal until my mid-40s, and has been degrading, and the curve seems to be dropping off. So I feel a different a different level of excitement about chaos. What's 104% of my capability rating is a little bit different, and the upcoming possibility of total breakdown of our society, aided and abetted by all of the things, AI and interconnectivity and all the rest of it. I have more trepidation than I might have had if I were 20 years younger.
Right.
A
similar reality in my life is that I am desperate to get out of South Africa. And it's sort of similar to what you're saying, because if I'm in South Africa, that comes with a whole lot of chaos. I'm not really ready for that kind of adventure, so here my 104% growing edge would be, I guess, diminished. But I guess I also, the thing I want to say is I don't know if geographical location will really prove to be much of a long-term determinant of, at least when we're talking about like survival, lasting until it sort of has resolved a bit. I think the things we'll be dealing with is going to be a lot more intellectual, a lot more like, what am I doing with my life? Who can I trust that's close to me? It's not going to be so much about maybe like physical security, but again, that it depends on where you are in the world as well. And the States is one of the places I'm actually not sure about. Like there are certain places I think, well, South Africa is not going to be great. Although even, actually, let me just take all that back. I'm not sure about anywhere, and that's part of it.
Well, I think the chaos is starting to undermine all of us. I mean,
Yes.
we are all, Schalk is already actively looking at 3 global locations to jump to.
Yeah.
I'm stuck here. I say stuck. I'm here in the Midwest, Iowa, Illinois, right on the river, corn country, agriculture dominates the conversation. Every farmer comes into the breakfast spot talking about how much rain he got last night. By the 10th, they've all got the rain gauge. I mean, but I'm looking at the U.S. as like, boy, it's looking like the fire is starting to burn pretty good around the edges of this house. I mean, holy wow. So and maybe I'm pretty far out on that curve in that I've traveled a lot. And so one of the guys I was working with now, he's the son of the owner of this company. I consider him to be wealthy and well off. He drives a nice pickup and blah, blah, blah. And he's got all kinds of 4-wheeler toys and stuff. He has never flown anywhere on an airplane.
Wow.
I was just like, what? I just said, to bump into that kind of a person here in the Midwest, I consider him to be affluent. He's certainly not in poverty by any means, and he's never flown on an airplane. Wow. And so when this house starts to burn down, he's not even going to know how to get on an airplane.
Yeah.
Whoa. I just, and anyway, I guess I'll shut up at that point. Go ahead, somebody else.
I think we're in an interesting point in the conversation. Just throwing out examples. The flames are getting hot. The outbursts. I was talking to a friend of mine locally who had been in the gun store locally, and essentially here in northern Vermont, according to this hearsay, there's a fairly good sizable contingent of people who think that the Civil War is going to be breaking out within a matter of months, and they're stockpiling ammunition. I don't talk to a lot of these people in my daily life because I sit here and work on my computer all day and talk to other people, but they're out there. And the other card that I want to lay out on the table here is in Schalk, when you were talking a little bit ago about the people who are the loudest, most entitled, and most likely to resort to violence, getting their way. As you were describing that, the picture that was growing in my mind was very much the white supremacists. right? The people who were invading the Minnesota courthouse, and you know, there's many other examples. We had a Black Lives Matter rally in the town next to me that was attended by 3 guys in a pickup truck waving Confederate flags and carrying guns. And driving around making lots of noise. And the good news is it sparked a lot of dialogue within the town. And I think that it's, you know, I think that there are valid critiques of the woke left about them stifling other voices. And I think we need to hear from the people who are questioning whether we really need to talk about Black Lives Matter. But I think we do, because I think that the loud, entitled, armed people who are willing to use violence tend to be those people who are already in significant positions of power already, and so that's, you know, that's the snapshot I want to put on the table.
Well, I think the thing is, like, part of what the sovereign individual is on about is going to really make lots of this stuff irrelevant. Really, like, I think those are, in my view, something like that is a complete sideshow, right? It's a complete sideshow, basically. I have this observation that I've made about South Africa, that the worst years, the years where you feel the worst about the country, are definitely election years. Very radical things that are very scary and inflammatory, so that their sense of importance gets maintained, right? And what's happening now versus your previous election cycle, I mean, I'm online a lot on a lot of different social media platforms and so forth, and what's interesting for me now is that the people who were pro-Donald Trump ruled the internet 4 years ago, right? If you go onto the Wayback Machine and you go look at what it looked like 4 years ago on Reddit, there were multiple posts from R the Donald were on the front page consistently, right? Then after that, Reddit repeatedly changed their algorithm to get them downvoted, and then eventually put them in quarantine, and then eventually flat out banned them. Now, if you go onto Reddit, you see the exact inverse thing, right? If you went on there, I mean, it would be ridiculous what your impression would be, at least of North America, right? But the fact of the matter is, I don't think these things live in isolation from the fact that this is an election year in the US. Right, all of this inflammatory bullshit, all of this stuff basically has to do with basically the clowns telling us how important they are, you know, and that one part of the argument, one side of the division that they've created is where you must fall on, and this is the most important election yet. That's what they'll tell you every cycle, you know. And the bad thing is just it's becoming more and more inflamed. It's becoming worse and worse, basically, as they basically start to tear this stuff down. The thing is, in my view, it feels very important to Americans. It feels super important to Americans, and Americans, since they project entertainment media all over the world, lots of the rest of us have this feeling of, Yana, it's super important to the President of the United States. The fact of the matter is, it's probably more important where the whole megapolitical thing is going to, what technology is doing to us, and this kind of stuff, right? And what I suspect is going to happen, basically, is whatever will happen to America will happen to America, but rich people will find ways to now suddenly move around and create far more wealth for themselves and everyone else in safer environments. Sorry, Logan.
Yeah, well, I on the idea of it being a sideshow, I just want to I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think there's ways in which it's true and also different frames in which it's not true. So, like, it is a sideshow if we zoom out far enough, you know, maybe in time, or maybe even just geopolitically, like the Black Lives Matter, the race riots, the stuff Gordon was talking about. But at the same time, I think you could also say it's an effect of systems collapsing and systems breaking down in certain ways, and it's the embers of a fire that could actually get pretty out of control. And so in that sense, it's not a sideshow. It's a
flashpoint.
Yeah,
well,
it's a potential flashpoint.
If the US becomes militarily destabilized, right, which is an incredible feat for anyone, by the way, that would be an incredible feat. Then I agree, we've seen a megapolitical shift of note, because essentially it would be the parallel would be the Roman Empire collapsing, basically, right? And I mean, that would destabilize the entire world. Even where you guys are now, even if you had a quote unquote civil war,
Is it just me, or is
a very one-sided civil war? I think people really
Schalk,
underestimate the enforcement power of the. What has happened?
You cut out for most of the last point.
It says my
when
my
you move
internet
outside,
connection is unstable.
Your data stream suffered or something like that. You know, it's not smooth. It's jaggy.
Okay, hold on.
Well, so while Schalk's sorting that out, I'll just point out we have just a few more minutes.
Let me move again. Okay, guys, but continue talking. I'll just reason.
Well, yeah, so maybe we could just close it out now. I'm just wondering, I guess I don't really know how to close out these, but I mostly just want to point out we only have
Okay,
a few
now I'm like
minutes.
next to the router.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, I don't know, any closing thoughts from you guys? I mean, I don't feel like I needed to speak to anything else. Maybe I can ask this, like, what was this conversation like for you guys? I think that would be cool to share just pretty quick in the last 3 minutes. Whoever wants to start.
Well, I really enjoyed it, but the only issue is just basically I don't know if we really got to anything, not anything, but we got to very little of the sovereign individual, you know, and the implications of the sovereign individual. I think we're sort of, and I think this is one of the dangers that the sovereign individual specifically talks about, is it's getting stuck in the local fluctuations and machinations of stuff, basically. And I know it feels like it's the end of the world and it's the most important thing that has ever happened, and all this kind of stuff. But I do want to say that I honestly think that what's happening in the US at the moment, to a very large degree, is just the fact that the media is collapsing, you know, and that social media that's supposed to be taking its place is still controlled by one side of the narrative, and their constant interference in the narrative has now inflamed the thing to ludicrous extents, combined with an election year. That's sort of like what I see is happening. I did really enjoy the conversation, though. I think we did have some interesting discussions about stuff, but I'd love to have another one and actually, like, you know, we actually go into more of the implications of the sovereign individual.
Yeah, let me jump in there, and I want to second that I really, really enjoyed the conversation. No matter where it went, I thought it was all good stuff. And I think that maybe the four of us are just sort of getting used to conversing with each other. And so, you know, maybe a second conversation could, I don't want to say stay on track, but you know, that's a way to say it, so we can stay on track better. Yeah, and I got 6:59 on my computer. I got to leave really for another appointment, really just about 1 minute. But and so if I can jump in with my positives on the sovereign or this coming change, and that is that I see two things. First of all, I'm a writer, and so that's a medium that I can monetize from any spot on the globe. I don't care how I'm remote. If I have my cell phone for a Wi-Fi hotspot, I can send off a story, and they can send money to me in crypto, and my whole economic engine can run no matter where I'm from, or where I'm at, I should say. Now, the other thing I'm involved in is a piece of hardware. It's an actual tool to be used by the towing industry. If your car breaks down and the tow truck shows up, he might want this tool in his toolbox of stuff. And so that's something that I can't move digitally. I have to put in a box and ship somewhere. I have to have it built in a factory that cannot move anywhere. So, you know, I have one foot in both worlds here. I can be a digital writer and go anywhere and still crank stuff out, or my tool that has to be manufactured in a factory that is still old school, has to have a physical location, can't move anywhere. And so I see that as a good thing. And anyway, so that's my last take on that, I guess. And I'm gonna have to run here in a couple minutes, guys. So go ahead.
I think this is a fantastic conversation. I really, really enjoy it. I'm glad, you know, I'm articulating a bit, leaning a bit in a devil's advocate kind of fashion in terms of articulating maybe a lefty perspective as opposed to, say, an Ayn Rand's perspective that I might have articulated in, you know, in a certain period of my life. So I'm really glad that we're able to bring at least those two poles into this conversation. Yeah, I'd love to continue it.
Cool. Yeah, I don't think you ever explicitly said that, Gordon, when we were planning this, but I got the impression that that would happen, I guess. And yeah, it's been good. I've really enjoyed it, and I agree, Dad, that like we're still learning how to have a conversation. I definitely love to do it again. Maybe with a 5-minute break in the middle, because I've had to pee for about 45 minutes now. All right, well, yeah. I think we can maybe end it there then. Okay.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. It was very nice chatting to you.
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks to everybody. Let's do it in the same group, and let's carry the conversation. And I'd like to go through the book, the points in the book some more.
Yeah. Cool. All righty. Bye, guys.
Cool.
You guys, thanks. Bye.
Thanks.